Hunter here on the show Streetwise, and thanks for joining us. It is actually our first broadcast on this particular show. Many of you know me as the host of the Business Forum show, but we have launched an all-new channel titled Streetwise, and we'll be covering a lot of information that comes from news on the street level and from those who are actually working the trenches in various functions throughout our community. In studio with me today is Kim Philia, and thanks for joining me, Kim.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about today about the Juvenile Detention Center. And I appreciate that you and I have had a chance to have contact back and forth. I saw the posting that you put up some time ago in Cowlitz County News and Cowlitz County News Uncensored, and appreciate that that was put up. I realize other people were involved as well as helping get some of the information out, but I'm glad we got a chance to touch base and kind of talk about this issue a little bit more thoroughly too.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and caring, because I'm concerned over the treatment of our kids.
So something I want you to make you aware of, and this is the reason I wanted to visit with you and why I was really interested in the details involved here, because what you have to share on what's going on in the Juvenile Detention Center is actually something that's happening in many departments throughout the county, and the issues are really the same. And so I'm glad that you have some of the details to help people understand a little bit more about that. So what I want to start with today is actually some of the stories around some of the kids that are involved in the Juvenile Detention Center. You told me about a schizophrenic boy who's 17 years old. Please tell that story to our listeners.
So the listeners should know that I'm a counselor, I'm a mental health therapist, and I was hired in the Juvenile Cowlitz County Youth Service Center, and my job was to create a program to help the kids to decrease recidivism, so to help the kids so that they can function in their families, back in the community, make a safe community.
And in layman's terms, that's essentially your role, is to prevent the kid from coming back into the juvenile system.
Correct. Yeah. And so I was pretty excited about that job when I first got in. It's right up my alley. I've been a kid counselor for numerous years. So when I got in, though, I was very disheartened for numerous reasons. But one of the reasons is the treatment of the kids. So they're trying to keep the kids in the system is one huge issue. The treatment goes along from many different levels. So you have to think about from the kids' perspective, and that the kids are have already gone through repetitive trauma in their life in some manner. Maybe they literally had abuse, maybe they were homeless, maybe their parents are doing drugs, and so they've been raised in a drug home. Whatever the situation, something's gone on at home.
I shared with you that I once ran a recruit camp with the Army.
Yeah.
And there was a certain percentage of the kids who came to the camp that were actually ordered there by a judge, because the various states do that.
Yeah.
And so I'm quite aware of the fact that many kids who are in a juvenile situation do have very much a checkered past. So there's no doubt that that exists there. A lot of bad influences coming from home.
Yeah. So to know that some of the kids are in great homes, but most of the kids, there's something at risk going on. So this one young man who got drug-induced schizophrenia, I met with the mom and him, and I met with him on prior occasions that he was incarcerated. The mom seems like a great mom. The mom actually asked for help for her kid. And in her words, she said, "This is not my kid anymore. And how can you help me? I don't know how to help him." So the kid's in our care, again, in the detention facility. And this time he was not taking his meds for his schizophrenia. So the guards felt that he was at risk of hurting others, or maybe the guards. So they put him in isolation. So my issue is not that they put him in isolation. It's the care that he received in isolation is the issue, because he was not taking his meds and he was hallucinating. So so he had been in isolation for at least 9 days, and I was not allowed to see the kid. I had to check in with the guards to see who I could see and who I couldn't see, so I was not allowed. So day 9 comes, and I was like, at this point, this kid has been in isolation for 9 days. So I went to Steve Jones, who's like 2 down, I guess, and he stated no, I could not still see him. So I said, well, I'm going to go, and I was taking my laptop to Steve Hogue, who's head of detention at the time, and asked Steve if I could please show this boy a quick little clip. It's a PBS clip, actually, on schizophrenia, just to try to help him realize what he's doing and take his meds so he can get out of isolation, was
Sure.
my thought.
Sure.
Steve Hogue said, yes, I can go back. So I went back, and when I was there, the boy immediately, recognized me because I've been with him several other times, and he's like, Miss Kim, help. And I said, help how? And he said, it's hot in here, please help me get out. And so they have a little sliding door, and so I put my hand over this sliding door, and he's radiating out of his room. And I look over at the guard, and I'm like, what the heck? And so what had happened in those 9 days prior to that, the guards were kind of teasing me, like, you can go back there now because he's at it again and he's getting naked. And I didn't feel appropriate for me to go back, so I didn't. But they were just kind of teasing anyways. They weren't going to allow me to go back. But he had, they had placed him on the girls' side in one of the empty pods, and so it was summer and the sun shining in the window, so it's just getting really hot in his room. And he was playing in the water in his toilet and the sink to try to cool off, and so they shut the water off. And so then
they took away his method of cooling himself.
Yes. So then supposedly he was getting naked and laying on the concrete floor, again, so he could cool off. And his concern when he was speaking with me in those few minutes, I was only allowed to see him about 15 minutes. In those few minutes, is it was going to be hot out again today, and he wanted out. So this was a Friday, and Mark was the guard, and I kind of scolded Mark then, and I left work early because I was so upset over the treatment of him, this young man. And then I called back and just said, will you please switch him over to the other side so at least he's not, and give him a few days on his meds. He was taking his meds then after we chatted. And when I came back Monday, he had not been switched over to the other side.
So he was still in the hot room. And you told me that your guess was the room was plus 90, over 90 degrees.
Yes.
Yes.
Easily.
And I think about that situation as a former Army officer, and whenever we had situations even out in the training field where temperatures reach 90 degrees or 90 degree plus, and the Army understands those to be in different heat categories, and heat injury becomes a very real possibility at temperatures like that. And so the fact that they're taking away his method of cooling himself and not making sure that he's able to be comfortable in that cell, to me, is just appalling, because I can imagine what would have happened to me had I allowed that to happen to any soldier that I was responsible for in the military. And I can tell you what I would have done to any NCO that reported directly to me if one of the soldiers in their care had been submitted to that. So completely unacceptable.
It is. And I visited this boy and other boys up at Green Hill, and they are not treated that way there. This is an issue with our youth correctional facility here in this county.
Well, we're going to go into some of the nuts and bolts of perhaps what are some of the roots of the problem, but I want you to share a couple of the other stories that I thought were really kind of highlight this, because there's many of them, but share the story about the 10-year-old child left in the home.
Yeah. So on the 10-year-old boy, so some of the kids have done something that would cause them to law enforcement to intervene in their home. And some of the kids really have not. They just needed a caring parent, really is all they need. So with this 10-year-old boy, he was abandoned, and his dad wasn't around. His mom did, drug and alcohol, and he was abandoned in the home at 10 in his apartment. And for 2 months, he was unfound like that. And somehow he finally got with a friend's grandma and resided with the friend's grandma. So the boy did not do, per se, any crime, so they categorized the crimes differently. So he did not do any kind of offense that would harm our well-being, any citizen's well-being. He smoked marijuana, got busted for smoking marijuana, but this was years before I actually knew the boy. He had been clean for at least 2 years. And he was still under the probation system, and he still had to report to court hearings in regards to his behavior. His defense is he's kind of a jokey kid, and he's super sweet, but he does a lot of antics, kind of like a class clown. And he did a class they sit in front of a computer for school, the school that he was in there at the detention facility, and they just have to read and push buttons, answer A, B, C, or D kind of for school, and there's no voice interaction from the teacher or the kids at all. So that needs to be stayed quiet. But this boy did an action in the classroom one day, went wha-bam, and so that got him back in court, and then he went up to Green Hill. So instead of ever looking for a home for him, like a foster home or anything for him to reside in, they cannot, it is a civil action suit. You cannot use detention facility as a means of housing. And yet, as in that boy's case, exactly what they were doing. And the sad part for me is literally these kids, all these kids, pretty much have cried to me and said, I'd love another life that was another boy's. But this boy that we were talking about, this 10-year-old boy said, oh, well, he said a bad word. Man, again. But what the thing is we are creating criminals because we're putting in their mindset that they did something horrifically wrong. And I wonder, like on teen boys, I have one, and what boy hasn't done a goofy action at a teenage age? And yet
all of them.
They're not in jail.
Exactly. So there's also the situation I wanted to share before we get into the other particulars. There was a situation of a 17-year-old boy who was supposed to be in detention for roughly 20 days or somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And he contacted you on, it was either day 17 or 18, and he was talking about harassment from the guards. I want you to share with our listeners that story.
So this boy had been in there, oh my gosh, like a lot of times. Like one of the boys said 35 times. He had been in and out of the detention system a lot. And he was in there for 22 days, as you mentioned, and I had been meeting with him almost every day, and he was doing really well, and just anytime he felt irritated or anything, just went back to his cell with a book. And so come about 19, he came, we'd be locked in a cell and we'd do counseling, and he came in and he looked really different. I'm like, what's up? And he said, oh, I'm just getting sick of it. And I'm like, sick of? So he's in the male pod, and some female officer is going in before they have to wake up and starting to harass him when he's still asleep. And this happened day after day after day. So this was for 3 days that this happened. And then, I don't know, last straw, whatever, he went into a broom closet, he broke a broom handle, and he started out of frustration. So how they pitched it was, he's attacking and all, and yes, he did get to that point. Prior to that, he was harassed for 3 days trying to stay calm.
So let's not miss the point as to why in this particular situation, and there's reasons why these other kids are recycled in the juvenile center as well. And it is about money. And I have found this trail of money and corruption connected to money in multiple departments in this county. And I lay a big chunk of responsibility, not just at the feet of past commissioners, because commissioners ultimately provide funding, allow these sorts of things to happen, but we'll get to some of this, but specifically, both Commissioners Karnofsky and Weber are aware of the issues that happen in a multitude of departments throughout this county, and corruption is being allowed to happen, and the county folks are essentially just simply doing what they're being rewarded for. So when you get paid, and you get paid extra money for these kinds of things to happen, I think that's what leads to these kinds of situations going on, because in my opinion, and I think you shared this with me as well, you can agree or disagree, but in my opinion, the reason why they were harassing this boy before his detention time was up is because if he responded to what the guards were harassing him with, he ends up being in the detention center for a longer period of time, and they are paid X dollars per day for each of the kids that are there. Are they not?
Yes. So do you think
it was money driven as the reason why they were doing this?
I do believe that is true. And that's part of my disheartenment that we can do this to kids, at-risk kids. So I started looking at going to state conventions and looking at what is out there in the state, what is evidence-based in the state, what can we do for these kids. And basically what it boils down to is the state has turned most of the juvenile detention facilities. Senator Hargrove took 331 beds offline, but they've turned most of it into a juvenile detention alternative initiative. So
and that's the JDAI you're talking about.
Yeah, so the JDAI, you don't lock up the kids unless they've done a crime against a person. But if they haven't done a crime against a person, they've done like truancy at school, you don't lock them up. You go into the home and see how you can help the home, and you provide community services to the kids. And that costs the state about $35 a day. Whereas if you lock them up, you're making about $240 a day just for housing. That's not counseling, and that's not this behavioral health tax on top of it. So what we have...
So just to recap, to lock a juvenile up, $240 a day, plus on all the services that get added on top of that. And if they were handled through JDAI, which I want to make sure that our listeners are aware, that 73% of the counties in our state are using JDAI. In fact, we'll get into this in a moment. There was a piece of legislation, House Bill 2677, which was proposed, and our commissioner, Dennis Weber, was against making this happen or allowing this bill to happen. And so there's all of this money, this $240 some dollars, they're not only seeing that it leads to a trail of corruption in terms of what they're doing to the kids for money, but they're actually compromising the outcome, because JDAI, from my understanding, is producing a much better outcome than the juvenile delinquent centers are.
Yeah, so there's many huge foundations and institutes working with justice policies that have, over a period of time, 10 plus years, looked at outcomes and where we're getting the outcomes for what, and what percent change are we getting. So this is a huge population, so it is evidence-based. And what they're showing is the community-based programs is a lot bigger bang for your buck. So you're getting, if a kid keeps recycling back in, each time they recycle back in, they have a greater chance of being a lifetime persistent criminal. So Hargrove says 73% of the adults that are incarcerated were juvenile incarcerated prior to becoming an adult incarcerated. So most of them are just working on being a persistent criminal. So if we did the community-based programs, which then most of them, 50% will not become a lifetime persistent criminal.
Sure.
And what, so you mentioned Dennis Weber, along with Dennis Weber, Chad Connors, who's the administrator for Cowlitz County Youth Services. The guards and the managers take orders from Chad, and Chad is issuing the way that the kids need to be treated. And him and Weber were the ones opposing that House Bill 2677.
And I want to pause you just for a moment, because I want to encourage our viewers out there, go look up House Bill 2677. Read the language. In fact, you have it here with you today, but we won't take the time to read through that. I'm just going to encourage our viewers to go out and read House Bill 2677. What's the current status right now on it, by the way?
It was opposed. It only stays open for, I understand, 3 months, and that was in January of this year. So it's
your opinion that this bill should be reconsidered, and you talked a little bit about why Senator Hargrove proposed this to begin with. What was the reason why he proposed this bill?
Sure. This bill was proposed by other senators, so you have 5 other senators that proposed this bill. And basically, currently, the language that we have to have a juvenile detention facility if the county population is 50,000 or over. And the bill was trying to close more detention facilities to kind of force them to put in the JDAI programs. So the community-based programs. It would save the state money, it'd save the county money.
And produce a more positive outcome.
Yep.
So it was a win all the way around.
Yes.
So in your opinion then, based on, you've had plenty of interaction with Mr. Connors. You've also had a chance to visit with Dennis Weber. Your opinions on why they would be in opposition to House Bill 2677?
They receive more money. Chad Connors says he wants a one-stop shop. And what this means is the state is putting in funding for these community-based programs. And so he wants these community-based programs because you receive that money. Plus, he wants to keep the detention facility open so you receive that money. And he mentions that he also wants to turn the 2 pods that are not in use, because you only have like 16 kids in there at a time. So there's 2 pods not in use, and he wants to turn it into a residential drug and alcohol treatment facility for the kids so he can keep them longer.
Wow. I want you to mention, because there's a few individuals, and I asked if you minded sharing names of some of the people that are involved, but there have been various sources that have made these comments to you, and I wrote a few of these down. They're interested in keeping jobs, they're interested in protecting their paycheck, and also interested in more of the money. So there's funding out there for these various things. In fact, I think it was Mr. Connors who made that, and I'm not actually mentioning his name in the attempt to target or pick on him specifically. All I'm saying, and the reason why I think these names are of importance to be included in something like this, is because we are seeing this level of activity happen in department after department after department throughout the whole county in various services. In fact, there's a nonprofit organization in this community whose executive, the highest executive position in the organization, this lady serves on 20 plus different boards and other committees and functions that all surround around funding around homelessness. The circle of corruption is just absolutely amazing. And I don't know if you serve on various committees or boards, but I have in many times during my life served on various boards, various committees in given communities that I've lived in. And I can tell you that once those boards or committees start to get to be 3 or 4 or even 5, your ability to do proper diligence to them becomes very minimal. And so when I think about somebody having their mitts in that many different things going on in the county, there can only be one reason why they're doing it, and that is to protect the money that's flowing in the county. So I bring that up, and that's another story that we'll host here on Streetwise, and we'll highlight specifically what that story is about, because a number of people are coming forward and sharing that as well. That this whole situation with Chad Connor's comments around the money, around the other individuals who've talked about this being a money thing for them, it's not uncommon, because when I mentioned that you get what you reward, when the commissioners and other people in leadership in this community and in this county fund these various operations, and they do so without any accountability, without any measurements, real measurements for success, and there's very little transparency going on in this whole process of what they're doing, well, that's a really big problem. And then you get situations just like this. So I want to go back to, for a moment, if you don't mind sharing, I'm interested in knowing who are some of the people that said money was the reason why they're doing this. Or
so there was
money.
another young man, another 17-year-old young man that I was called back to de-escalate. And I started talking to this boy about rules, like which rules he would be okay with and why. And so I met with the boy several times, and I walk out of that lockup room, and so the head of the jail was Steve Jones, or his Steve Jones now, Steve Hogue, and Steve Hogue kind of smiled at me. He goes, "You have a way with these kids," and I'm like, "Thanks, but I don't have any legs." And he knew what I meant, because I had already asked, can we do JDAI? Can we do the evidence-based 14 promising practices by the Department of Justice? I'd already asked, and I'd already been turned down by Chad several times. So my comment of, I don't have any legs, like I can't help these kids. And Steve goes, he goes, "We're just trying to keep jobs." And at the time that didn't make sense, and I left. But then I started researching what was going on at the state level. So, and then once I started researching what went on at the state level, that's when I realized, oh, they get a lot more money for doing this. That's what he's saying about, because the state's trying to decrease the juvenile detention facilities.
Sure.
And and we also have we have on our capital improvement budget from 2016 to 2020, $23 million is allotted out. 70% of that $23 million is going to the Hall of Justice, and 14% of that $23 million is going to the juvenile facility. So you have your operation budget that's costing the taxpayers over $4 million a year to run for 16 kids locked up at a time. And you have your capital budget of $23 million that 14% is going. And you have your behavioral health tax that most of that as well is going to CCYSC, the Cowlitz County Youth Services.
It's incredible. It's incredible. It just goes on and on. So I want to wrap this up. We are going to launch a follow-up to this, which is actually to discuss some of the more specific details in depth, because one of the things that I've become aware of through our conversation, a little bit of my own research as well, but looking at this, and I'm seeing a very possible volatile situation coming out of all of this, because when we take into consideration Washington state law and how it looks at these various situations that are happening right here in our juvenile detention center in this county, how these kids are being handled, how the money is being used. You mentioned about the situation of the 10-year-old boy and them essentially using juvenile system for housing for them. There are so many potential violations of Washington state law that we're going to have some discussion about the RCWs that are actually in question here as a result of how this practice is being handled. So for those of you who have interest in looking up more information, I would encourage you to go look up House Bill 2677. This is a bill that Commissioner Weber opposed, and Chad Connors as well, who's connected with the Juvenile Detention Center, or Detention Center rather. I also would encourage you to go up and look up JDAI, which stands for Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. And it's the program that Kim Philia here has been talking about, and the program that 73% of the state already endorses. The reason why this House Bill 2677 was actually put into place or proposed was because they are trying to force counties just like ours, who are refusing to move away from this not only very costly but very ineffective way of dealing with kids, to move to JDAI, which is not only significantly cheaper but has a much better outcome. And it is all about the kids. Unfortunately, here in Cowlitz County, our system is all about the money. I ask you to think about that when you go to the voting booth or when you send in your ballots. We have two sitting commissioners. Actually, all three of them are aware of the situation currently.
I met with each of them multiple times.
Yes, you've met with each of them. So all three commissioners are aware of this problem. Two of them are up for election. If you expect to see this problem with the Juvenile Detention Center and any of the other departments in Cowlitz County actually getting addressed, we require new leadership here in Cowlitz County. I'm Kevin Hunter. My special guest is Kim Philia. And thanks for joining us here on this special broadcast from StreetWYZE.